If you're hearing this, know that stories like mine aren't about medals or glory. They're about choices, the ones nobody notices until it's too late to go back. I survived because I refused to stay quiet, because I refused to let betrayal define my path. And maybe that makes me dangerous in someone's eyes. But survival, real survival, isn't about winning battles on the outside. It's about keeping your integrity when the world tries to strip it away. On this channel, Silent Soldier Vibe, we share the stories that don't make headlines, the battles fought in silence, the courage that doesn't always get celebrated. Strength isn't always loud, courage isn't always visible, and revenge doesn't always look like bullets or fists. It can be subtle, deliberate, and lasting. If this story made you think, made you feel, or made you question who you'd trust in the heat of chaos, stay with us, because every soldier has a story, every battle has a lesson, and some truths aren't meant to stay buried. I've shared mine. Now it's your turn to listen, learn, and carry it forward. And always remember, silence can save your life, but truth defines it. This is Silent Soldier Vibe, where her silence is her strength and her story becomes yours. When it was finally over, at least on paper, there was no ceremony, no handshake, no moment where someone looked me in the eye and said I'd done the right thing, because that's not how endings work in the real military. Endings come quietly, disguised as transfers, as new orders, as polite conversations where everyone pretends the last few months didn't change anything, and I was moved to a different assignment, far from the people and places tied to the investigation, not as punishment, officially, but not as reward either, just a clean way to separate me from the mess I'd helped uncover. And for a while, that stung more than I expected, because some small part of me still wanted validation, still wanted proof that standing up mattered. But distance has a way of sharpening perspective, and with time, I started to understand the real lesson buried under everything I'd lived through, that morality in uniform isn't about being perfect or heroic. It's about deciding what you're willing to carry when nobody's watching. And I carried the truth, even when it made me inconvenient, even when it made me dangerous to the narrative. And that choice changed me in ways I didn't see right away. Because after betrayal, trust doesn't vanish completely. It just becomes deliberate, earned in pieces instead of assumed. And I stopped measuring my worth by rank or recognition, and started measuring it by whether I could sleep at night knowing I hadn't stayed silent to protect my own comfort. And that's the part people don't like to hear, that doing the right thing doesn't always make you whole. Sometimes it leaves scars you have to learn to live with, because revenge, real revenge, isn't about hurting someone back. It's about refusing to let what they did define the truth. And my revenge was unforgivable, not because it was cruel, but because it removed the shield of denial people hide behind. And I learned that institutions don't love individuals, they love stability. And when truth threatens stability, the instinct is to smooth it over, to manage it, to make it disappear without admitting it ever existed. And knowing that doesn't make me bitter, it makes me realistic, because realism is how you survive long after the mission ends. And I don't regret what I did, even when the nights get quiet and doubt tries to replay the what-ifs, because I know exactly where the other path would have led, to silence, to self-betrayal, to becoming the kind of soldier who tells herself it wasn't her problem, and I couldn't live with that. So instead, I live with the knowledge that I forced a line into the sand, that somewhere down the chain things changed, maybe not loudly, maybe not publicly, but enough to matter. And that's the moral people miss when they want clean endings, that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like prevention, like something bad not happening again because someone spoke up once and refused to be erased. And if you're listening to this wondering what you would have done, I won't pretend it's easy or that everyone should make the same choice, but I will say this. Silence feels safer until you realize it costs you pieces of yourself you don't get back. And strength isn't about winning every fight. It's about deciding which losses you're willing to accept. And I accepted the loss of comfort, of approval, of a career path that would have been smoother if I'd kept my head down, because some lines don't deserve to be crossed quietly, and some truths deserve to be carried even when they're heavy. And if there's one thing I'd leave behind for anyone wearing a uniform or trusting a system bigger than themselves, it's this: loyalty doesn't mean blindness, and courage doesn't always look like charging forward. Sometimes it looks like standing still and refusing to move when everyone else wants you gone. And I'm still standing, still breathing, still carrying the weight of what I chose. And I'd make that choice again, because at the end of it all, when the noise fades and the titles don't matter, the only thing you really answer to is yourself. And I didn't betray her. I thought the worst part was already behind me when I walked out of that secure room, because I believed exposure automatically led to consequences, that once the truth was laid out clean and undeniable, the system would do what it claimed to stand for. But that belief didn't survive very long, because the first twist wasn't about him fighting back, it was about everyone else going quiet, meetings getting postponed, emails unanswered, investigations pending review. And suddenly the urgency I'd felt inside that room vanished like it had never existed, replaced by process and delay and language designed to buy time. And that's when I realized I wasn't just confronting one corrupt officer, I was brushing up against an entire structure that had learned how to protect itself by moving slowly and letting people like me burn out. And the deeper I pushed, the more resistance I felt. Not loud resistance, not threats or open hostility, but soft pressure, reassignment orders that came without explanation, mandatory evaluations, subtle suggestions that maybe captivity had affected my judgment, because nothing discredits inconvenient truth faster than questioning the messenger's stability. And for a moment, I almost fell into that trap, almost let exhaustion and frustration convince me that maybe this was as far as I could go, that survival alone should have been enough. But then the second twist hit, the one that changed everything, when a junior analyst I barely knew slipped me a data drive and told me to look at it off-network, his hands shaking just enough to tell me he was risking something by doing it. And what I found on that drive rewrote the entire story, because it wasn't just one mission or one reroute or one betrayal. It was a pattern stretching back months, multiple operations compromised in similar ways, assets disappearing, weapons ending up exactly where they shouldn't, and the same names appearing quietly in approval chains that were never meant to overlap. And my capture wasn't an isolated incident, it was the one that went wrong because I didn't die like I was supposed to. And that realization hit harder than anything I'd faced in captivity, because it meant my survival had turned me from collateral damage into a liability, not just to one man, but to a network of people who had built careers on the assumption that nobody would ever connect the dots. And suddenly the question wasn't whether the truth would come out, it was whether I'd be allowed to stay alive long enough to deliver it. And the paranoia that followed wasn't dramatic, it was practical, changing routines, limiting who I spoke to, documenting everything twice. Because when institutions start protecting themselves, they don't need to silence you violently, they just need to isolate you until you disappear professionally. And that's exactly what started happening. Doors closing, trusted contacts going distant, people who used to greet me warmly suddenly keeping conversations surface level. And the mission lead, the man who started all this, he never confronted me directly again. He didn't need to, because power doesn't lash out when it knows it can wait you out. And the third twist came when I realized something even darker, that parts of the system I believed were compromised were actually aware, not corrupt in the traditional sense, but willing to look the other way because the outcomes benefited larger strategic goals. Dirty hands justified by clean reports. And my capture, my suffering, my near erasure, it had been written off as acceptable loss in a bigger game. And that knowledge broke whatever innocence I had left, because betrayal from one person hurts, but betrayal from an idea, from the belief that the institution will protect its own if the truth is clear enough, that cuts aper. And I had to decide then whether I was fighting for justice or just for my own closure, because the two don't always align. And I chose exposure over comfort, even knowing it could cost me everything. And I started moving information outside the channels designed to bury it, quietly, carefully, ensuring copies existed where they couldn't all be destroyed at once, because the only leverage you have against a system is redundancy. And the moment that information left my hands, things accelerated. Sudden interest from oversight bodies, questions that couldn't be brushed aside anymore, whispers turning into formal inquiries. And that's when the narrative flipped, because now it wasn't about whether I was unstable, it was about how much damage control needed to happen before this reached daylight. And the mission lead finally cracked, not publicly, not dramatically, but in the way cowards do, by shifting blame downward, sacrificing smaller players, claiming ignorance, framing himself as another cog. And watching that unfold was almost harder than captivity, because it showed me how easy it is for truth to be reshaped when enough people are invested in the outcome. And the final twist came quietly, almost unclimactically, when I was informed that the investigation would proceed without my involvement, that I'd be reassigned indefinitely for my own protection, and that certain details would remain classified for national security reasons, which is the cleanest way to say the truth will be managed, not revealed. And standing there listening to that explanation, I understood the full weight of what I'd done, because I hadn't just exposed a betrayal, I'd crossed a line that separates soldiers who follow the system from soldiers who force it to look at itself. And that line is unforgiving. And I walked away knowing I would never see a courtroom victory or a public reckoning, knowing that accountability in this world doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like prevention. Operations shut down quietly, people moved sideways instead of promoted, damage contained instead of celebrated. And my revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't bloody or loud, it was structural. It disrupted something that depended on silence, and that's why they called it unforgivable. Not because it was wrong, but because it worked. And as I sat alone later processing what it cost and what it changed, I realized that the twist in this story wasn't that I survived or that I exposed a traitor, it was that I learned the truth doesn't come with applause, it comes with consequences. And once you pull on a thread like that, there's no clean way to put the fabric back together. And whether they admit it or not, they'll remember me as the one who didn't disappear the way she was supposed to. I moved through that stretch of desert like I'd never worn a uniform in my life, keeping low, staying patient, trusting muscle memory over emotion. Because once you've been betrayed, you stop romanticizing the system and start dealing with reality as it is. And the reality was simple. I couldn't just walk back into friendly lines and expect everything to make sense again, because whatever machine decided I was disposable was still running, and machines don't stop unless someone jams the gears. So I picked my moment carefully, intercepted just enough radio chatter to know which units were where, which ones weren't, and when I finally made contact with an allied patrol under cover of darkness, the looks on their faces told me everything before they even spoke. Shock mixed with discomfort, like they'd seen a ghost they weren't sure they were allowed to acknowledge. And when one of them finally said my name, it sounded more like a question than a greeting, because I wasn't supposed to be standing there breathing. And I kept my answers short, professional, controlled, because the fastest way to get silenced is to sound emotional. And as they processed me back through channels that suddenly felt very narrow, I noticed how careful everyone was being with their words, how often phrases like above my pay grade and pending confirmation popped up. And that caution confirmed my suspicion that my survival was inconvenient, because it forced conversations people thought they'd already buried. And when I was brought in front of command staff, I didn't unload, didn't accuse, didn't even mention betrayal right away. I stuck to facts, dates, locations, timings, because facts don't flinch when challenged. And I watched the room as I spoke, saw who leaned forward, who avoided eye contact, who stiffened when I mentioned the reroute. And when his name came up, the mission leads, the air shifted just enough to notice. Not panic, not outrage, but irritation, like someone dealing with a problem they thought was already solved. And that reaction told me I was on the right trail. And they tried to contain it fast. Reassignment discussions, medical evaluations, quiet suggestions that I take time before giving a full report. But I refused to disappear again, because disappearing once was enough for a lifetime. And instead of pushing directly, I went sideways, started pulling logs, requesting comm records,
cross-referencing timestamps, leaning on people who still believed the system could be corrected instead of protected. And the more I dug, the uglier it got. Weapons shipments that didn't match inventory, intel sources that led back to the same intermediaries, mission adjustments that benefited someone else's timeline instead of ours. And every thread circled back to the same few signatures, the same approvals that overrode objections quietly. And confronting him directly wasn't an option yet, because power doesn't crumble when accused, it crumbles when exposed. So I built my case slowly, piece by piece, knowing every move I made was being watched, because once you threaten a structure, the structure pushes back. And it did. Rumors about my stability, questions about my judgment after captivity, subtle reminders that careers can end quietly. And I won't lie, there were moments when doubt crept in, moments when the weight of it all pressed hard enough to make me wonder if the cost was worth it. But then I'd remember the days in that room, the silence from my own side, the realization that I was written off without a second thought, and that memory burned hotter than fear ever could. And the confrontation came sooner than expected, not in some dramatic showdown, but in a secure room with neutral walls and closed doors, where rank usually does the talking. And when he walked in and saw me sitting there, alive, unbroken, watching him, his composure slipped just for a second, enough for me to see the calculation behind his eyes. And he tried to play it cool, congratulated me on surviving, framed it like an unfortunate outcome of a dangerous job. But I didn't interrupt him, because people reveal themselves best when they think they're still in control. And when he finished, I slid the first piece of evidence across the table, then the second, then the third. And with each one, his confidence thinned, because explanations only work until facts show up. And he reached for rank, reminded everyone who he was, what he'd done, how much he'd given. And I reminded him, quietly, that none of that erased numbers, timestamps, or recordings. And the room shifted again, this time heavier, because now it wasn't about me anymore. It was about them, about how far the rot went and who else might get dragged into the light. And the confrontation ended without raised voices, without cuffs, without closure, just a decision to investigate further, which in military language means slow, careful, and controlled. And as I walked out of that room, I knew the hardest part wasn't over, because exposure doesn't guarantee justice, it just guarantees resistance. And I felt eyes on my back the whole way, measuring, weighing whether I was worth the trouble I represented. But I also felt something else, something steadier, the certainty that I'd crossed a point of no return, that even if this crushed me professionally, even if I paid for it in ways nobody would ever publicly acknowledge, I couldn't unsee what I'd seen or unknow what I knew. And that kind of clarity is dangerous to people who survive on silence. And as I prepared for whatever came next, reassignment, isolation, retaliation, I understood that confrontation isn't always about winning in the moment. Sometimes it's about forcing the truth into a room where it can't be ignored, even if everyone wishes you stayed dead. Time stops feeling normal when you're being held somewhere nobody plans to admit exists. Days stretch and compress at the same time, and you start measuring life in small things, like how often the guards change shifts, or how long the generator coughs before it settles into that low mechanical hum. And captivity doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in slow. Because the first thing they really take isn't your freedom, it's your sense of control, the ability to decide when you sit, when you stand, when you speak. And they tested me constantly, pushing just hard enough to see where I'd crack, asking the same questions in different ways, offering water like it was a favor instead of a basic human need. And I learned quickly that patience is a weapon, that every second you don't react is a second you're still thinking, still collecting information, still alive in ways they can't see. And I watched them the way I'd watched targets back on missions, noticed who talked too much, who avoided eye contact, who cut corners when they thought nobody was paying attention. Because even in captivity, the rules don't change. People are patterns, and patterns break. And nights were the worst, because that's when the noise died down and your own thoughts get loud, when doubt tries to crawl in and tell you that maybe they were right to write you off, that maybe you pushed too hard and paid the price. But every time that voice showed up, I shut it down by replaying facts, not feelings. Facts like how the ambush lined up perfectly with the reroute, how backup vanished at exactly the wrong moment, how nobody came looking. And facts don't care about guilt or regret. Facts just sit there waiting to be acknowledged. And as days passed, I realized they weren't moving me, which meant one of two things. Either they felt secure enough not to worry about rescue, or rescue wasn't coming at all. And both options pointed back to the same conclusion. Someone on my side had closed the book on me. And that realization didn't break me, it sharpened me. Because hope based on rescue fades fast, but hope based on yourself lasts longer. And I started planning, not an escape yet, but survival, conserving energy, keeping my injuries from getting worse, responding just enough to stay valuable without giving them anything real. Because leverage works both ways if you know how to play it. And then came the mistake, the one every captor makes eventually: complacency. Guards rotating faster, doors staying unlocked a little longer, voices getting sloppy because they believed the story they were told, that I was done, forgotten, neutralized. And I listened, piecing together fragments of radio chatter, overheard arguments, mentions of a deal gone wrong somewhere else. And that's when I realized my capture wasn't just convenient, it was connected, part of something bigger than removing a problem soldier. And that knowledge changed the math, because if there was a larger operation in play, then loose ends mattered, and I was a loose end breathing in their custody. And the moment that truth settled in, I knew my clock wasn't just ticking toward escape, it was ticking toward being erased. And fear finally showed up then. Real fear. Not the quick adrenaline spike you get in a firefight, but the slow kind that sinks into your bones. Because there's nothing heroic about being quietly disposed of. No last stand, no witness, just disappearance. And I refused to let that be my ending. So I waited, watched, and the opportunity came disguised as routine. A guard rushing through a check, zip ties reused one too many times, hands not as tight as before. And when the lights flickered during a power hiccup, I acted without hesitation, because hesitation kills more soldiers than bullets ever do. And the escape wasn't clean or cinematic, it was messy and painful and driven by raw instinct. Hands shaking, heart pounding, body screaming to stop. But I kept moving because momentum is life. And when I finally slipped into the open night air, lungs burning, blood in my mouth, I didn't feel victory. I felt clarity. Because escape wasn't the end of this chapter, it was the beginning of the hardest part, figuring out who I could trust in a world that already decided I didn't matter. And I moved slow, avoided roads, followed the same rules I'd lived by in the field: stay invisible, stay unpredictable. And as I scavenged what I needed to keep going, radio batteries, scraps of intel, bits of overheard communication, a bigger picture started forming, one that tied black market weapons, bad intel, and compromised leadership together into something ugly and deliberate. And every new piece confirmed what my gut already knew, that my capture wasn't an accident of war, it was a business decision. And when I finally intercepted friendly chatter and realized nobody was actively searching for me, not even pretending, something inside me shifted permanently. Because there's a moment in every soldier's life when the uniform stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like just fabric. And that moment hit me hard, but it also freed me. Because once you accept you're on your own, you stop waiting for permission to survive. And I made a decision then, alone, under a sky that didn't care who lived or died, that I wasn't going to just crawl back and accept whatever explanation they handed me. I was going to find proof, solid, undeniable proof, because truth is heavier than rank when it's backed by evidence. And as I moved toward the edges of what I knew, toward places I was never meant to see, I understood that this wasn't about revenge yet. It was about exposure, about dragging something buried into the light, even if it burned everyone standing too close, including me. And that understanding hardened me more than any training ever had. Because once you decide the truth matters more than your own comfort, there's no going back. And I kept moving, carrying that decision with me like a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment to use it.
I enlisted when I was 19. Not because I believed the recruiting posters or wanted medals pinned to my chest, but because my older brother didn't come home and nobody could give my family a straight answer that actually made sense.
just folded flags and quiet voices, and a lot of words that sounded important but meant nothing. So I signed my name on the line because I needed to understand the world that took him, and because anger is a powerful fuel when you don't know where else to put it. And from day one, I learned that the military doesn't care why you're there. It only cares if you can carry your weight. And I carried mine and then some, because being the only woman around meant every mistake stuck longer and every win disappeared faster. So I stopped chasing approval and focused on precision, on doing the job clean and quiet, on becoming useful in ways nobody could argue with. And by the time I hit my second deployment, I was attached to a small intel recon unit that worked in the shadows. No cameras, no parades, just long nights, short briefings, and decisions that mattered even when nobody would ever know our names. And that's where things started to shift. Subtle at first, the kind of change you only notice if you're paying attention. Intel that came in too neat, routes that looked safe on paper but felt wrong in your gut. Locals disappearing hours before we rolled through, like someone tipped them off. And I flagged it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way professionals do. But every time I spoke up, I got the same response. A nod, a note taken, and then nothing. Like my words evaporated the second they hit the air. And it wasn't just me noticing either, but I was the one pushing hardest, because patterns don't lie, even when people do. And that's when the distance started. Conversations stopping when I walked into the room, side glances during briefings, the mission lead tightening his jaw whenever I asked one question too many. He was a decorated officer, the kind people trusted without thinking twice. Smooth voice, clean record, and the ability to shut down dissent without raising his tone. And when he told me I was reading ghosts and needed to dial it back, I wanted to believe him, because trusting your chain of command is baked into you. But trust doesn't erase instinct, and instinct kept tapping me on the shoulder, saying something was rotten. And then came the reroute, last-minute change, barely discussed, pushed through like it was routine. And I remember looking at the map and feeling my stomach tighten, because that road made no sense, not tactically, not logistically, not unless someone already knew what waited at the end of it. And I said as much, calmly, professionally, and he shut it down in front of everyone, reminded me who was in charge, reminded the room to stay focused. And in that moment, I felt it, that invisible line where concern turns into threat in someone else's eyes. And after that, my role started shrinking. Fewer tasks, less input, my name missing from planning threads, like I was being slowly erased before anyone pulled the trigger. And I told myself I was being paranoid because war messes with your head, and you don't want to be the soldier who cries conspiracy every time things get weird. But the day of the mission proved I wasn't wrong, because systems failed too cleanly. Backup shifted at the wrong moment, our timing slipped just enough to leave me exposed. And when the convoy split the way it did, I ended up exactly where I shouldn't have been. Isolated, uncovered, and walking straight into hands that were already waiting. And sitting there later with dirt in my mouth and zip ties burning my wrists, every memory snapped into place like a finished puzzle. Because betrayal rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, hides behind procedure and rank and plausible excuses. And the hardest part wasn't realizing someone sold me out. It was realizing how long they'd been setting the table, how many chances there were to stop it if anyone had listened. And as the days passed in captivity and the outside world stayed silent, it became clear that my absence was convenient, that operations continued without disruption, that nobody was scrambling the way they should have been. And that told me more than any confession ever could. Because when a soldier disappears and the machine doesn't even slow down, it means someone already decided she wasn't worth saving. And that's when my anger changed shape, stopped being loud and emotional, and turned cold and focused. Because I didn't just want out, I wanted answers and I wanted accountability. Not the kind that ends in a report buried in a file, but the kind that makes people uncomfortable, the kind that forces the truth into the light, whether it's welcome or not. And I promised myself in that dark room that if I survived, if I got my hands back on the pieces of my life they tried to take, I wouldn't let this disappear into silence. Because silence is how betrayal survives. And I was done being quiet.
I didn't scream when they grabbed me, didn't fight when my face hit the dirt, not because I was fearless, but because in that exact second, I already knew something was off. Because ambushes like that don't just happen unless someone clears the road ahead of time, unless someone makes sure you're alone, unless someone decides you're expendable. And as the sky stayed quiet with no drone buzz, no friendly chatter in my ear, no backup calling my name, it hit me harder than the zip ties biting into my wrists that this wasn't bad luck, this wasn't chaos, this was planned, every step of it, every turn on that road that wasn't on the map, every checkpoint that wasn't supposed to exist, and every second I spent standing there outnumbered made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't the enemy winning, this was betrayal doing its job. And when they ripped my radio away like they knew exactly where it sat on my vest, when they tore my unit patch off and stripped my name tape like it mattered to erase who I was, one of them smiled, and that smile told me more than any interrogation ever could. Because I wasn't a prisoner to them, I was a message, a piece on a board someone else was playing. And as they shoved me toward the truck, I started replaying every briefing in my head, every glance that lingered too long, every order that came down a little too fast, the mission lead avoiding my eyes, the reroute pushed through last minute, the way my questions were shut down with that calm voice telling me I was overthinking it, like instinct was a flaw instead of a survival skill. And sitting there blindfolded with my hands numb and the engine roaring, I felt something colder than fear. Because fear fades, adrenaline fades, but betrayal sinks in slow and deep, especially when it comes wearing the same flag you do. And I thought about how I was the only woman in my unit, how that never scared me because I didn't need approval, I needed competence. And I had earned my place the hard way, through busted knuckles, sleepless nights, perfect calls under pressure, pulling guys out when everything went sideways. So when my intel started getting ignored and my reports started getting questioned and my voice started carrying less weight in the room, I noticed. I just didn't think the price would be this high. And when they dragged me into that half-collapsed building that smelled like dust and oil and old violence, they didn't hit me right away, which told me they wanted something more than pain. They wanted leverage, information, time. And I gave them silence because silence is the one thing they couldn't steal from me. And as I sat there counting breaths to keep my head straight, I stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about names, about who signed off on that change, who moved the convoy, who decided I was the liability that needed removing. Because survival in war isn't just about getting out alive, it's about understanding why someone wanted you gone in the first place. And I knew then that if I walked out of that place breathing, I wasn't coming back the same soldier they sent in, because war teaches you more than how to shoot or bleed quietly. It teaches you that some lines, once crossed, don't deserve forgiveness, and some betrayals don't get buried, they get answered. And as long as I was still breathing, this story wasn't over, not by a long shot.